Your oversight requirements for program modifications and how to approve a pre-treatment program, so the difference between substantial modifications and non-substantial modifications. So this is what we're going to discuss: who, what, when, where, how, why why you guys have to review their programs and how you would do it, when you would do it, and your role as the approval authority in the state. So Chuck mentioned this, when or which POTWs are required to develop a pre-treatment program. So, if you have a POTW that has a total design flow, that means if a POTW has multiple wastewater treatment plants, if their combined treatment capacity of the multiple plants is over 5 gallons per day, and they have an SIU in their service area, they're required to have a program. But if you have a smaller POTW with a smaller plant, less than 5, but they have, issues with complying with MPDS permits, you at the state should probably require them to have a pre-treatment program. And there's one POTW in particular that we're dealing with in one of the regions that they're requiring a smaller plant to actually develop a program because they have categorical industrial users. They have TDS issues. The city is blowing their TDS limits, and in their annual report it says these TDS issues are caused by industrial discharges, right? So, but the POTW, the city's like, no, but we don't need a pre-treatment program. But in your annual report it says, it's a long story, but they're trying to figure that one out. And so there's a couple of places you can review as the approval authority to determine whether or not a POTW should develop a pre-treatment program. Once every 5 years, they're supposed to submit an MPDS permit application. So, take a look at their design flow, their maximum average, and their daily maximum, and see what that is. That's a good starting point, reviewing applications. And then, part F of the application, the POTW is supposed to tell you whether or not they have SIUs and CIUs. So, if they have SIUs and CIUs listed in their MPDS permit application, probably another little flag that says, maybe this POTW, if they don't already have one, should have a pre-treatment program. So as the approval authority, you have to approve and deny requests for modifications and stuff like that. And so once you decide that a POTW is required to have a program, you have to review that program submission to determine whether or not it complies with all the requirements of the federal guidelines. And then after you approve a program, it has to be incorporated into their MPDS permit. So that MPDS permit has to be modified to incorporate required pre-treatment requirements. And then after a program has been adopted and it's been implemented, and if they want any additional modifications, the POTWs should submit those modifications to you for review and our approval. And that's what you come in again. So you have a brand new POTW that's developed a program. You have to review, make sure that it's wholly complete. And there is currently a manual, EPA manual. I know it's dated 1983. But as Chuck mentioned, Tetra Tech is revising this manual to update the rules and regulations, but for the most part, there is a checklist. There's a checklist in there, and you can use that checklist. And in general, it hits all the main points. But you have to keep in mind there has been significant regulation changes since 1983 to the general pre-treatment regs. So you can use that checklist, but refer to 403, the pre-treatment regulations, to make sure everything's covered. But we are updating that manual, and we're hoping to get that out this year. Fingers crossed. And then in this checklist, there's some on the provisions, the citations are wrong because there have been amendments to the 403. So keep that in mind too if you're using it.
There is also an updated checklist for legal authority within the audit. The audit checklist. It's
right.
What, 2000?
The audit? The audit's older.
But it includes streamlining. Basically, it's post-streamlining.
Yes, it's post-streamlining, and it's also a separate document on EPA's website. If you go to epa.gov/NPDES, there's a little menu, a little window on the one hand, and you click on pre-treatment, and then the pre-treatment page will pop up, and click on publications. then you can do a control F find for legal authority, and then you'll find that legal authority checklist. But we'll show you what that looks like later on today. So these are the program requirements, the components that are required in a program submission. And it's outlined here, and we'll go through these in detail in the next slides. So the legal authority proportion, they have to, in their submission, they have to include the ordinance that they have, their enforcement response plan, and if there are other jurisdictions discharging to the POTW, they have to have agreements signed by all parties. And then any endorsement by the mayor, by the city attorney saying, hey, we will implement these procedures as, adopted in our ordinance, and all those things in a submission. And then the legal authority, they have to have the legal authority to do all these highlighted things, and these are all listed in 403.8. They have to have the authority to deny or condition review increases in pollutant discharge, compliance with pre-treatment requirements, the authority to issue permits to their industrial users, and so forth. All these things. So if you see any portion of their submission, they don't include this, as an approval authority, you can write them a letter saying, hey, it's not sufficient. You need to amend it. It's in the back. It could be a phone call, it could be a letter, whatever you're more comfortable with. And a POTW that's developing a program, they're usually in contact with you all the time anyway. Open that channel of communications. Before they submit, a 100-page document to you, talk to them. Open up, talk to them, help them out as much as you can. That will help you with your review and make the process work and make it go faster.
What do you mean by implementation confidentiality requirement?
So the legal authority requirement is there are for implementation of confidentiality requirements. So there's information that an SIU submits to a POTW that the SIU or IU claims to be confidential. So the POTW has to realize what can be determined, what can be classified as confidential and what cannot be, like flow information. Sampling data can never be classified as confidential, and it can never be confidential to the approval authority, to EPA, or the regulators. It's like if you guys are going in to inspect the POTW, that data should be freely to you, anything. But then if they have like your Hostess cupcakes and there's a recipe and they're saying that's confidential information, the POTW should have procedures on how they're going to keep that information confidential and away from the public. So they need to have procedures of determining what is confidential and what is not. And part of the submission, there should also be an enforcement response plan. Like Chuck mentioned, that's just a guide on how you're taking enforcement, so everybody's getting the same type of enforcement. You can't, I like ABC Plating because they're really nice and they buy the city lunch every day. I'm not going to be as strict. That doesn't happen with the ERP. If you have an ERP in place, it lays everything out. And it should tell, the ERP should tell who's going to take what type of enforcement. Are you going to let your inspectors to issue on-site notice of violations and warning letters? Or is the POTW going to require all enforcement to be signed by like the mayor or the superintendent of the wastewater treatment plant or forth? So the plan should outline all of that. And then other procedures that should be included in submission is how the POTW will update their industrial wastewater survey. In the initial part of developing a program, they have to go and survey who are their non-domestic users. But that's not a one-time thing, that's a continual thing, because people go in and people come out. So they should have procedures on how they're going to update that. Are they going to drive by? Are they going to look at phone books? Are they going to review water consumption rates to find SIUs when they cross over to that threshold? How are they going to do that? And then you have to evaluate to determine whether the procedures they're suggesting is it going to be adequate. Is that going to adequate to cover all of their new industrial waste users? And if there are other jurisdictions going to the POTW, how are they going to get that information from the other jurisdiction? is the permit holder gonna go out to that other jurisdiction and do drive-bys? Or is that jurisdiction gonna submit that information to the permit holder? You have to evaluate all of that. And other program procedures that must be included is, how are they gonna notify the IUs of the applicable requirements they're gonna be held to? Are they gonna do it via letter? Are they gonna do it via a permit? What type of control mechanism? How is the POTW going to analyze and receive reports? Is, reports gonna be submitted to the secretary? Is the secretary gonna log it in? Who's gonna review that to determine those reports are adequate? Is there some type of system where they will upload the limits and that they're let a spreadsheet check, cross-reference limits? All of that should be spelled out in their submission. And then how are they going to do sampling, compliance monitoring? Have they established a frequency? Like if I'm a SIU that discharges 25,000 gallons, we're going to sample them twice a year. But if you go over 50,000 gallons per day, we're going to sample you quarterly. They should spell all that out. Other implementation procedures, the slug discharge control evaluation. The federal requirement is within a year of determining a non-domestic user as a significant user. The POTW is required to do the slug evaluation. So have they incorporated that into their procedures?
Within a year of when Streamline is trying to.
What the USIC?
Yeah.
And then how are they going to investigate instances of non-compliance? And that ties into their ERP. How are they going to handle public notifications? Once a year, they have to publish all industrial SIUs in significant non-compliance, so that they build in the cost of publication into their procedures. Do they account for that in their budget? And then how are they going to deal with public participation in local limits, changes in their ordinance, and all those things? You just have to review the submission for all of those. Open the door. So here's some more information about industrial waste surveys. Like, have they identified, so when they're sending you that initial submission, they're supposed to include a list of all their IUs that they have found during their initial industrial waste survey. So the survey should include the information they submit to you, should include all these things. So you can take a look at what they have currently. And this is just the same thing, Part F. You can evaluate what they submit to you with their Part F and make sure they're consistent. Like if Part F says they have 7 SIUs, but then in their survey information they submit to you, they only have 3, what happened to the others? Did they move? Did they just forget? Whatever. So, you have ways of cross-referencing to make sure things are consistent. Just other parts of the permit application. And then, previously we had talked about local limits. So if you're a POTW required to have a program, you're required to develop local limits. So you get to review local limits to make sure that they've been calculated appropriately. Staffing, we talked about staffing briefly. Do they have the appropriate number of staff? If you have 1,000 SIUs, they're saying, 2 full-time equivalents would be enough to run a program for 1,000. That's a big red flag. So make sure that the numbers kind of work out. And some POTWs will outsource sampling, so obviously the full-time equivalent staff would decrease. So you can evaluate. You have to gauge what is acceptable.
For example, Chattanooga has 80 permitted SIUs. They only have 2 people in the pre-treatment program, but they don't do any of the sampling. The collection systems crew does all that for them. So however they, if they explain to you how they're doing that so that you ensure that they're covered, that's fine.
But if they're doing everything, if like the staff of 2 is doing inspections and sampling and permit writing for 1,000, that's not going to get done. And right back. So who can initiate an approval or modification? You as the approval authority, after a year of, or whatever, of a program in existence, you notice that the program is actually not being ran or is not as efficient or adequate as it needs to be. you as the approval authority can amend our NPDES permit or requirements and say, hey, you need to do X, Y, and Z to improve your program. Or the modification can be initiated by the POTW. They realize that, hey, we don't like our sampling frequency because at the very early stages of our program, all these SIUs were new to us. That's why we had them sampling monthly. But now that we know them and we're very used to their characteristics of waste, we want to reduce that to twice a year. So they can initiate a change in sampling frequency. And so changes can be initiated by either party, the POTW or the approval authority. And so we talked about when a modification is necessary, if there's changes in operation, if there are federal rules are changed, like the streamlining. When the streamlining was promulgated, there were some changes in the general pretreatment regulations. So the program had to be amended for that because some of those provisions were becoming more stringent. So that's when modifications are required. So what's the difference between substantial and non-substantial? They are defined in 403.18. So a substantial modification requires the POTW to submit that to you, and you have to approve it before they can implement it. And a non-substantial modification is they submit that to you within at least 45 days prior to their implementation date. And if you have a problem with that, you have to notify them of your issue or concern within 45 days, because if they don't hear back from you within 45 days, they can go ahead and implement that. So if there were going to be some changes in personnel, they're going from 3 FTEs to 1 FTE, and it's considered non-substantial, and they don't hear back from you in 45 days, but you know that 1 FTE couldn't ever implement the program, but they don't hear from you, they can go ahead and implement that. So, be prompt in responding. If you have a concern and it falls under non-substantial, be prompt in telling them that you have a concern, an email, a letter, or whatever. But these substantial modifications, they can't implement until they hear from you. So here's the procedures for approving substantial modifications. They have to submit to you the modification and rationale behind the modification, and then you have to do, the approval authority has to follow the public notice procedures in 403.11. And like I said, non-substantial modifications, the approval authority must notify within 45 days, but if you don't, they can go ahead and implement that. The same thing, reiterating non-substantial modifications. If you don't let them know, they can implement it. Incorporation of modifications to NPDES permit. So 403.8 tells you when, what, and where, and how to do that. I don't know how many people are also responsible for writing NPDES permits in addition to pretreatment. In addition to other stuff, stormwater and okay. So you'll have go here and look at the requirements, and I think we have NPDES permit writers course for all of this too. And is there a webcast for that?
Yes.
There is. So the federal requirements are the permit must be modified to incorporate approved programs, and we talked about that. So if a new POTW develop a program, and the approval authority has approved the program, their permit needs to be modified so they can incorporate all the pretreatment requirements into the installation. And here's just some sample language of what NPDES permit language looks like for pretreatment programs. There's more sample language, samples. Any questions? I told you I can go fast. Any questions? Yes.
So if the city decides to do the monitoring at an industrial user rather than having them self-monitor,
Okay.
substantial or non-substantial?
So previously all the IUs were doing sampling. It depends on the frequency. It's multiple layers. Like if the IU was doing quarterly, and then the city's going to take back all the monitoring, and they're they're just gonna do it semi-annually,
Mhm.
that's actually a decrease in frequency.
Sure.
And so that would be considered substantial.
What if it's gonna be the same frequency?
If it's the same, then I would think it's non-substantial. Like if it's 4, they're gonna continue with the 4, but the city's gonna do all of it. It's still the same number.
Cool.
One thing to keep in mind is that you may have additional approval requirements for taking modifications to your board. I think, there you go. I think we've talked to a couple regional boards about this and with some attorneys, and I think certainly for substantial modifications, I believe you need to take it to the board for approval. Yeah. Do we know for non-substantial?
I believe we, as
Okay.
part of our process.
Okay. So just another thing to keep in mind.
Is that in, an agreement between the state and the EPA, or is that?
We have no.
That's just
So
an
that's
internal.
just the
Suggestion?
state.
Is that just a suggestion? That we have to take it to the board to approve something?
I'd have to double check on that, whether it's in our APM or not.
The agreement that I had with the Keith, that say for instance, there's a substantial modification with a local limit, he agreed that we would incorporate it into the end of permit once it's up for that normal, reissuance, and not reopen.
So you didn't amend the permit and issue new language, but did you issue some sort of documentation to the city that it was approved, like a letter approving it?
Quasi, no.
Okay. And then that quasi language is gonna be incorporated into the permit when it came for renewal. Right, you just address it at permit renewal.
I've asked the permit writers to incorporate that date in which that substantial modification came to be
Mhm.
and the subject. Whether or not it gets done, is the permits are done every 5 years.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, the response for substantial or non-substantial modifications, is that just locally or
It should be written.
what should we?
Because as, when we go and audit a POTW's program and they say, oh, we made these changes and the board gave us an approval, we don't know for sure unless we see a documentation. And so if they can't prove, an email, a letter, we're like, I don't believe you.
Well, we don't say I don't believe.
I know, it's trust but verify, right? As, when we go.
We don't
and
believe them, but we don't say it.
No, we're like, oh, but we need documentation because we get told a lot of things. And so more times than not, we get told one thing and then when we go and dig in the files and look into their documents, it's not that whatsoever. So we trust but verify. And in order to verify, we have to see documentation.
Right.
Right? Trust but verify. Any other questions?